Alrighty, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Friday in this case. Today I'm going to do part 1 of our chapter 22 plants. I'm going to basically run off of the notes that I've given you and just add a few things, show you some pictures, define a few things. Plants are super interesting. They're also one of the more complicated things, which is one of the reasons why we kind of leave them for last. And you'll see where we're going to make connections to other things that we've talked about this year, especially with evolution. But I'm also going to go off and talk a little bit about something that's unique to plants, which I'll get into this chunk. But I'm going to try to keep these to 5 or 6, or I'm going to try to keep these to like 10 to maybe 15-minute chunks just for timing. All right, so a couple things. We're going to start super simple. Characteristics of plants. So what is a plant? So for this, we're looking at anything within the kingdom Plantae. So there are 4 main features, or 3.5. Eukaryotic. So as a reminder, this has a nucleus in the cell. So similar to animal phyla, they have eukaryotic cells. Next thing that's important is that they have a cell wall which contains cellulose, so this is sort of a rigid supporting structure. And you can think back to when you were talking about cells, maybe in like grade 9 or grade 10, where they had like a plant cell and they had an animal cell, and they kind of had these sort of, there was a lot of similar things. They generally had this thing called a vacuole. So similar structure on the inside for the most part, but then they had this sort of extra layer, and they were generally drawn as square shaped, and they had this much more rigid structure to them. Alright, next up, something called autotrophic. So this is referring to how they get their energy. So we talked about this at the beginning of the year. Auto is, in this case, we can refer to it as sort of self. And anytime you see the word trophic, or see the part of the word trophic, it means energy. So for us to consider something a plant, it has to be able to produce its own energy. The main way it does this is through photosynthesis, and it uses 2 types of chemicals, either chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. There are a few plants that fall out of this category. They can either be parasitic, so they can prey on other organisms and kind of steal their energy, or there's also this term called a saprobe, which feeds off dead or decaying matter. So in this case, they're not quite autotrophic. They're more parasitic. They get their energy from something else because they've lost their ability to photosynthesize. There's a few exceptions, but generally most are autotrophic. Also, they're mostly multicellular, which means they have more than one cell. I say mostly because we consider some types of algae are called plants. We used to put all algae in this kingdom Protista, so they were protists, but since then we realized that they have more in common with plants. So remember how we had that sort of phylogenetic tree of all life, and we've been slowly redefining things to kind of better suit what we've seen? This is part of that change. Alright, what plants need? So, a couple of things. They need sunlight. This is for photosynthesis. So, we've all done that poster or picture, or seen that picture of the sunlight coming in, plants producing energy, and then using it. Next up, they needed some sort of gas exchange, so they need oxygen for cellular respiration. So one of the things that's kind of a misconception is a lot of people think that the photosynthesis is what the only process for plants to use their energy. In fact, they actually use the same process that we do. we use cellular respiration in our cells. When we breathe in oxygen, we use sugar from food that we eat, and then we get energy out of it. Plants need that too. So where photosynthesis comes into play is actually to make the sugar. So I have down here, photosynthesis makes the sugar, and one of the cool things about this is that they're complementary processes. So cellular respiration, I'll just put that here, and then photosynth here. So the chemicals that are made, so photosynthesis, it makes O2 and it takes in CO2. Cellular respiration gives off CO2 and takes in oxygen. So it is very complementary in that fact. Other parts that they need, plants need water, and lastly, they need minerals. So similar to us needing a vitamin, they are made of more than just hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. So they need other things to make DNA, proteins, enzymes, because they use the same basic building blocks that we do. So they also need other things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in order for them to carry out their life functions. So evolutionary history of plants. Origins in the water. So we do have some fossil records of plants, and we think that today's land plants originated from the water, just like how we think that today's land animals came from the water. And a majority of these were photosynthetic eukaryotes, but they only had one cell. So this right here, you kind of have two directions to go. You can either stay as a unicellular photosynthetic eukaryote, or you can start becoming multicellular. So the organisms that have stayed are what's referred to as green algae. So we make a little bit of a distinction here. We refer to green algae as plants, and then there's other types of algae which we usually give like a different name to that are still considered protists or part of a different kingdom. So then first land plants, although fossil spores of land plants occurred about 475 million years old, we have some fossils of plants being found on land up to 50 million years later. So one of the greatest challenges was finding water, because if you're moving from an aquatic environment to a non-aquatic environment, there is suddenly exponentially less water for you. So what we can think of is kind of the same thing happening with early land animals, where we have sort of an amphibian state where they're living in water and in land. So for plants don't have the opportunity of moving. So over time, the demands of life on land favored evolution of plants that were more resistant to drying rays of the sun, more capable of conserving water, and more capable of reproducing without water. So these are all forms of our directional selection. You can think if an animal or if a plant has an easier time living on land, it's going to be more successful, and over time those successes are going to build and push the plants one way or the other. The organisms that are less adapted to surviving on land are either going to remain in the water or they're going to die off. So we have an overview of the plant kingdom. We have 5 major groups, and there's 4 important features. Embryo formation sounds weird, but plants do in fact have embryo stages. Specialized water conducting tissues, we'll talk about that. Seeds and flowers. We can ignore this, I'll be putting diagrams in. So this is a bit of an overview. Now we're going to get to the cooler part of plants. The part that's very, very, very unique, and it gives people a lot of trouble because it's nothing like we see in the animal kingdom. So I'm going to spend a good chunk of time on this, and then I'll probably cut the video off just to give us some time to kind of take stuff in, 1 page at a time. So plant life cycle. The life cycle on land plants has 2 alternating phases. We refer to one as I'll use highlighter, a diploid 2N phase called a sporophyte, so a spore-making plant. There is also something called a haploid phase, and it has this letter N, called a gametophyte, so a gamete-making plant. So I'll talk about what these all mean, but what we can think of, plants sort of have like two bodies or an avatar of themselves. So first up, I want to talk about haploid and diploid. So this N and 2N refers to how many sets of chromosomes you have. 2N means you have 2 sets, N means you only have 1 set. So haploid organisms carry a single set of chromosomes in their cell nuclei. So what we're referring to, it'll be easier if I talk about diploid first. So when we talk about chromosomes, we always think of them sort of coming in these pairs, like we had our X and we had our Y chromosomes. Well, that's the same here. Whereas with haploid, we would have only one set, only one half. We don't have them in pairs, we have single ones. We see this in animals in their gametes. So when I say gametes, I'm referring to sperm and egg cells. So interestingly enough, every plant that lives on land has this double life cycle, where part of their life is spent with only a single set of chromosomes in their cell nuclei, and then part of them lives in a diploid phase where they have a double set. And which set you're in is sort of determined by the animal, or by the plant, sorry, and what they're doing at the time. So a sporophyte produces haploid spores, and they use meiosis to accomplish this, which then grow into multicellular gametophytes. So right away we're seeing a change here. This would be like if our sperm or egg cells turned into an organism all on its own. Now, this process is asexual, and then each gametophyte produces the sex cells like sperm and egg, which then fuse during fertilization to produce a diploid zygote. So it would be like if our sperm and egg cells produce their own organism that then produced their own sperm and egg cells that then became a new creature. And then then the cycle repeats. To kind of highlight this, I'll show this image real quick. So there's 2 halves, and I'll kind of divide it right down the middle here. So I'll be showing this for each major type of plants, but you can see here we're talking about a fern. So here's the mature fern that we kind of all see. This part here, the actual fern, is the sporophyte. At some point it makes these little spores. If I go this way, it has these little spores on or sporangium at the bottom of their leaves, and then these release single haploid spores that then grow into something called a gametophyte. And then through fertilization, the gametophyte grows a new sporophyte. And you can actually see in this picture, they're attached. The last thing I'll show you, because we're getting close to 15 minutes, is I'm going to talk about a human-plant analogy. And I'm going to use my friend Keanu here. So if we imagine if humans acted like plants, we start with a sporophyte, 2N, then through an asexual process, this 2N Keanu makes some spores, that only have half of his genetic material, so they only have 1 set of chromosomes, which then grow into the gametophyte, which I will use little Keanu to help us out here. So, same genetic material. Again, this is an asexual process, which then, if I move over here, a new gametophyte comes in and they produce gametes or sex cells. They release them, they become fertilized, and then a new sporophyte will grow from this fertilization. In some cases, they will be one organism. In some cases, they will detach, depending on which type of plant you're talking about, and then the cycle repeats. Now, one thing, I'll say different stages are dominant in different organisms. So one of the things I'll be talking about as I'm talking about the different classes of plants is, depending on which ones we talk about, the gametophyte stage might be the one that the animal or the plant spends most of its lifespan in, and in others it might actually be the sporophyte that's dominant. So one of the things you'll see is I'll say gametophyte dominant or sporophyte dominant, and you'll see as we progressively get into more complex organisms, the sporophyte becomes a much more dominant stage in the life cycle of plants. In any case, I'm going to stop here. It's a lot to take in. I'm going to be building on these processes later throughout the week. I'm hoping to get one of these videos out once every couple of days, just because we're running short on time. So if you're still following along, hopefully you found this enjoyable. Hopefully you find the analogy a little bit helpful, because this is one of the more complicated processes that's very different than what we're used to. As always, take care, stay safe, have a good one.